I think we'll start. So thanks a lot for coming back. We have the ICTS monthly colloquium once a month, and James's talk is going to be embedded in this colloquium. So James is visiting us from APL. He did his PhD at University of Washington, Seattle, and then he spent some time at Woods Oceanographic Institution. And then he returned to APL as a scientist. So he's going to talk about small-scale dynamics in the ocean, internal waves at small scales, and how they connect to large-scale dynamics. So in this program, we had a lot of talks on modeling mesoscales and sub-mesoscales, etc. So James is going to talk from an observational point of view. He's primarily an observational scientist. He'll talk about how he constructs these instruments which can measure internal gravity waves in the ocean, and how we can detect properties of small scales and connect it to large-scale dynamics. So James, thanks for attending.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much to Jim and to the committee for this workshop for inviting me. I'm glad to have a chance to visit the ICTS and see this campus. I've heard about it before, and I'm glad to get to experience it myself. I'm going to be talking about a project that's I'm mainly going to be focusing on a new project. Is this too loud? It almost sounds too loud to me, but anyway, a new project that started with the NOPP National Oceanographic Partnership Program, and it'll be very preliminary in terms of how many results I have from that project, but I think I wanted to include some sort of a decent amount of background on why we want to study internal waves in the ocean, how it's important for the meridional overturning circulation, how internal waves have been measured so far, and how that leads to potential for a global observing program that can maybe help also inform the next generation of climate models. My colleagues at APL are Zoli Schutz, Emilio Mayorga, Aurelie Moulin, Renchi Lian, and Sebastian Essink has just moved from APL, but we have also colleagues at NOAA and in two different divisions, as well as we're working with Teledyne Web Research for building our instruments. I'll go through sort of three main topics. First, I'll be giving some background. I hope it's not too much background and review for most of you, but it probably will be background for a fair number on the internal waves and the global circulation. A little bit about the current state of observational and modeling tools, and then this new experiment that we started about a year ago, and where we are so far. And these aren't entirely in order. I think I will jump around a little bit between these topics, but it's roughly in that order. First of all, the ocean overturning circulation. A bit of a schematic here, looking from the perspective of the Americas towards Antarctica. We're looking at the Pacific, where you can see. So we've talked about carbon dioxide coming from the atmosphere into the deep ocean for one thing. Also, the overturning circulation is important for heat transport and for sort of keeping the climate in some ways the way it is. And there's both these. There's kind of the biggest cell in the Atlantic, I guess, and then the deep cells are actually what covers the biggest volume in both the Pacific, the Indian, and a little bit in the Atlantic. And that's where really all of the anthropogenic carbon, most of it, will end up eventually, but that takes hundreds of years, and the rate of getting it into the deep ocean is fairly slow. But the upwelling part of all of these meridional limbs requires mixing an internal and in some way to get the heat down, except where the water is able to get to the surface and be modified by surface fluxes. In some cases, that happens in the ACC. But in any case, the deep parts that do require mixing, that was noticed for quite a while ago, but Walter Munk has made several estimates of how much mixing you need for this, and this paper from Munk and Wunsch kind of breaks down the amount of energy required to keep that overturning circulation working, and they inferred that you need a fair amount from internal tides, especially, and you need about something like 2 terawatts altogether. Some of that comes from the wind, some of that comes from the tides. And the two main flavors of internal waves are the wind-generated near-inertial waves and the tidal-generated internal tides. I'll get a little bit more into what those are and how they're different, and what other kinds of internal waves are involved in this process too. Still on that same topic, some estimates of the amount of mixing made by Eric Kunze in a recent not too long ago, JPO paper from global hydrography, deep hydrography, looking at fine-scale shear and strain. He's made some estimates of the vertical transport in the different oceans, and comes up to something like that 20 Sverdrups of the deep ocean abyssal cell, but also breaking it down between the boundaries and the interior. So in this estimate, the deepest part of the cell is mostly dominated by the boundary mixing, and then in the interior, the upper part of the cell dominates. So there is internal wave breaking in the interior as well as on the boundary, and the partition of where the breaking, where the mixing happens, and what processes are driving that mixing has big implications for where the vertical transport does occur and how that overturning circulation works. I mean, we still have a very cartoon view of the overall overturning circulation, and so I think it's not a settled story exactly how this works by any means. So what we do think does most of the mixing in the deep ocean is internal waves, and there are a number of different processes that generate internal waves. There's the winds generate inertial oscillations, and then there's the tides generate internal waves due to flow over topography. There's also low mode propagation, and I'll get into that a little bit as well, from many of the tidal generation locations, so that you can have generation in one place and then you can have breaking at the boundaries. And so a lot of the mixing on the boundaries might be due to internal tides that are generated somewhere completely different. This is a schematic from Jen McKinnon, BAM's article about it was a climate process team that was aiming to produce an internal wave parameterization for climate models. And they came up with some parameterizations that I believe have been at least adopted a bit, or at least they're being considered in various ways. But I think there's they wouldn't have said that this is done yet. So this is the kind of processes we're talking about. Now just going back a little bit more, I hope this is also not unwelcome, but what are internal waves? So, well, internal waves, they can act on, they can propagate on the interface in a two-layer fluid, but if you have continuous stratification, they move vertically, and they move at an angle that depends on their frequency. There's a group velocity and a phase velocity which are perpendicular to each other, and they can propagate between frequencies between F and N. So the Coriolis frequency F sets a lower bound, and the buoyancy frequency N sets the upper bound of these propagating waves. And then on the large vertical scales, they tend to look like baroclinic modes, and there's particular structures where the ocean can act a bit like a two-layer fluid or a three-layer fluid at these different modal structures. And so internal tides in particular tend to be forced most at the low modes. So mode 1 and the first couple of modes tends to carry most of the internal tide energy. The flow over topography of the barotropic tides, the barotropic tide flows over topography and propagates these waves away from ridges or any kind of rough spots where you have vertical velocity that's perturbing the stratification. And let's see, one thing that was realized kind of maybe in the, I don't know, kind of at the advent of satellite altimetry was that you could observe these waves from space just from their sea surface height signal. And so this is, I'm going to show a couple of figures from some work that Zhongjing Zhao has done along with Matthew Alford and myself and a couple of other colleagues looking at these propagating waves from altimetry, and that involves fitting tidal harmonics. So you're isolating a particular frequency of the tide, and you're looking for waves at that frequency. Even though the altimeter doesn't really resolve that frequency, the very narrow band of the tides and the very fixed sampling of the altimeter allows you to do this over years of data. And you can look for propagating waves as long as you know what the mode structure looks like. So this is from climatology. We get something about the phase speed. We can get the ratio of the internal displacement to the sea surface height. So it tends to be a few meters of internal displacement for each millimeter of sea surface height displacement. And then you can fit these propagating waves, and you can get a pattern over the globe that looks like this, where you have radiating waves away from the Hawaiian Ridge, from the Polynesian Ridge, for a bunch of other sites around the world. And so these are actually, so here this is just showing the amplitude of the waves, but this method actually is able to get energy flux of these waves in a couple of different frequencies and a couple of different modes. But mostly the first mode, M2, is the dominant one. And at about the time that people realized you could get global maps of the internal tide, they also realized you could make models of the global internal tide. So Harper Simmons, Brian Arbick, and Bob Hallberg wrote this paper where they started a model from rest forced by barotropic tides. And this is kind of just an example of how these waves work. This is just over a few days, you start to get the waves propagating away from topography until they're basically filling up the whole ocean. And these are, this particular run isn't perfect. It has too much internal tide, but overall, the models are able, they're capable with their fairly limited resolution of simulating these waves. It still has to be, I think this might have been a 1/4 degree or 1/8 of a degree model, something like that in resolution. But you do need to have, and it didn't have a whole lot of vertical levels either. It was only had a couple of modes that it could simulate in vertical. And I guess what I'm going to start to build up is that we're kind of getting close to being able to have modeling capability for internal waves and global observing capability for internal waves, not just from satellite and for low mode internal tides, but for other flavors of internal waves as well. This is about the near inertial waves. Now, near inertial waves are the lowest frequency of internal waves. They tend to be mostly horizontal, although interestingly enough, you can also, I'm coming back. You can also observe internal near inertial waves from vertical displacements of Argo floats that are drifting at 1,000 meters. This is a displacement, a vertical displacement frequency spectrum from Argo floats, and it shows a peak just above F. So at the frequency of F, there's very little energy, but at just a little bit above F, that's near inertial internal waves, and then there's a spectrum that looks a lot like the Girton-Monk sort of background spectrum of internal waves. I'll get to the spectrum in a moment, but let's see. The other products for near inertial waves are surface. So near inertial waves tend to be generated at the surface by the winds. So you can observe them from the motions of drifters at the Coriolis frequency. And there's been maps of that made at different seasons. And then from another data set that I'll mention a little bit more, profiling floats that I've used with a velocity measurement have been able to get the near inertial energy below the surface from looking at half inertial separated pairs of profiles and just getting the difference between those to get the energy in the inertial band. And this is in the Southern Ocean in the Dimes experiment. Now, one thing that this collection of profiles gave was some hint of the intermittency of these waves. So the green here is low levels of inertial kinetic energy. Purple is high levels of inertial kinetic energy. Yellow and blue are kind of in between, and you get kind of a background that's there most of the time with sort of intermittent events of high energy, and that's kind of true about a lot of these internal wave processes. So you need to have a lot of observations to kind of build up the statistics of that of this wave process, wave generation process, really. And then actually near inertial waves can be observed, can be found in models as well. This is a model from Harper Simmons showing internal near inertial energy fluxes, horizontal energy fluxes in mostly low mode near inertial waves. Now, those have not been very well observed in the ocean, except there are a few places where moorings have been able to, the red arrows in here are actually moorings that were estimating the low mode near inertial energy flux, and they actually qualitatively agree pretty well with this model simulation. It's also been noticed that at times the model near inertial waves can be a little harder to simulate, especially in more of the newer generation operational models where you're trying to get like the response of the wind in the models, but you're also trying to keep the model connected to satellite altimetry and an eddy structure that's realistic. Sometimes that data assimilation step can generate near inertial waves because it's such a resonant frequency in the models. So that's been something that this NOPP project is working on. One last thing that global models have been able to do is start to show a spectrum of internal waves. There's some work by Malte Müller with HICOM group, that where you can see a limited number of modes are being resolved in global models, and they're starting to maybe move towards being able to build out a full spectrum of the waves. It really depends on the resolution of the models. Okay, and so those things put together got the NOPP, the National Oceanographic Partnership Program, to propose a global internal waves experiment, and there was a call for funding, and 6 teams were selected, and I'm on one of the teams called SQUID Profiling Floats. And I'll mention briefly what the other teams on this in this group are doing. Most of them are modeling, but there's well, it's almost half observations, but I guess it's 3 observations and 3 models. So there's Martin Bosman, Brian Arbeck, Jay Shriver at NRL are working on kind of process modeling of internal tides mostly. There's an observational group at Scripps and Hui, including sort of 3 different groups, subgroups. Amy Waterhouse, Drew Lucas, Uwe Zent are making some moorings, and especially built around the SWAT satellite. So there's, I won't get into SWAT too much, but there's a new satellite which will even makes this whole topic more exciting to look at, measuring high resolution maps of sea surface height. But in the process of calibrating the SWAT satellite, Jinbo Wang had wanted to put out some moorings over the SWAT crossovers in this fast repeat phase, and so this NOPP project was able to partner with the SWAT group and put out bottom pressure and inverted echo sounders, as well as some full water column moorings. There is actually a website where those you can look at what's being found on that from those moorings already. And I think some of the links are on this NOPP Global Internal Waves at UCSD website, and also a description of all these teams. There's a team working specifically on this data assimilation problem that I mentioned. So near inertial waves, when people started looking in HICOM for near inertial waves, especially in the data assimilation version, the operational version of HICOM, they realized that they were all coming from all over the place, and they were not very realistic, and so that they realized that the data assimilation step was actually forcing these waves just from anytime you nudge the model, it can kind of produce them. And they've got kind of a fix that seems to be working, but it's something to kind of keep watching out for. And then there's also Ed Zarin and Santa Akela at NASA Goddard is working on MOM6 implementation of tides and internal tides, and kind of trying to improve things for that. There's another, in the process of looking at the internal wave field, they've discovered another issue with some of the models. I think there's a thermobaric instability that wasn't really causing any problems, but for internal tides, it seemed to be an issue. So it's kind of helping people learn about the details of these models, which is beneficial as well. I think that's been fixed. And then finally, there's another observational group led by Kurt Polzen and Jacob Wennergrad and Annalisa Brecko, looking at bottom boundary layer processes, and they're going to be making measurements in the Brazil Basin, kind of revisiting some of the Brazil Basin abyssal tracer release experiment. Anyway, I'm happy to talk more about this project. But for now, I'm going to go into the tools that my project, the SQUID, is going to be using, and that's first. So SQUID is the Sampling Quantitative Internal Wave Distributions, and we're specifically using a type of measurement that measure profiling floats similar to the Argo program that measure horizontal velocity. So here's a little bit of history of EM velocity profilers and the theory behind them. What is the EM apex velocity measurement? So first of all, it's and I would be surprised if most of you knew this already, but EM velocity measurement is using the flow of the Earth's magnetic, the flow of the conducting seawater through the Earth's magnetic field, and that generates electric currents. So here is an example of if the Earth's magnetic field, we're actually only interested in the vertical component, and we have a horizontal current moving through the Earth's magnetic field. There's a Lorentz force to the left of the current, well, to the right of the current in this case, with the field going down, and so the electric current is going. Let's see. So you can use your right hand rule and look at the flow of the current. Yeah, so there's so the it's to the left of the current is where the electric, to the left of the water current is where the electric current is flowing in the northern hemisphere where the vertical magnetic field is downward. And then that tends to actually build up electric charges on either side of a strong current, say the Gulf Stream or something. So this is just sort of an example of how the theory works, but it's more general than just this case. So you build up electric charges where you have positive charges on one side of the current and negative on the other side. And in fact, that causes at the bottom where there isn't as much current, the electric current is flowing in the opposite direction. So really you have when you measure with a set of electrodes in the seawater, you measure the electric current. You're just measuring the potential of the electrodes, but you're also moving with the seawater with these profilers. You're measuring the difference between the local water velocity across the geomagnetic field, the difference between that and the depth averaged water velocity, which is producing this charge separation. And that depth averaged water velocity, it's actually not quite the exact depth average, because you can have some of this return flow is not within the water column, but within conducting sediments below the water column. So we call this V bar star as it's the conductivity weighted and down to the depth where there's no conductive sediments, average horizontal velocity. But so measuring a horizontal voltage from an instrument fixed on the seafloor is actually measuring this V bar star, or the horizontal potential gradient, directly, whereas a profiler that's moving with the flow is measuring the difference between the local flow and the depth averaged, or the V bar star, depth independent quantity. And that concept was explored pretty thoroughly by Tom Sanford, who's shown here, dropping a profiler over the side of a ship. Tom Sanford wasn't the first one to come up with this. This was kind of actually the idea of measuring water flow with electrodes was attempted by Faraday back in the 1800s, and it didn't work because he was in fairly fresh water. He didn't have very good measurement apparatus. He was trying to measure the flow of the Thames. But there was oceanographers in the 50s, including Henry Stommel and Bill von Arx and a number of German scientists as well. I don't remember who exactly were the main leads there, but there were a number of people trying to do towed instruments called the GEK, the Geomagnetic Electrokinetograph. And this is a schematic of one of several different types of instruments that use this approach. And that towed instrument, Tom had a version called the TTM. And in the end, I think the interpretation was one thing that kind of frustrated a lot of people, both the instrumentation and the interpretation. But Tom was the one who came up with this interpretation of the difference between the local flow and the depth average flow is what you're measuring with a profiling instrument. So Tom had a number of different profiling instruments, including an expendable version, a ship-deployed recoverable version called the AVP, Absolute Velocity Profiler, and now we have a profiling float version similar to Argo floats, but it's got an extra electrode measurement on it, and it has to rotate in order to remove the potential of the electrodes, because the electrodes tend to have big signals of their own that we don't want to measure. And then this is also used for submarine cables. So you can measure the voltage across the Gulf Stream, and there's a long history of that as even a climate time series of the Gulf Stream transport. There's about a volt signal across the Gulf Stream. And NOAA, at least up until recently, were monitoring. I haven't heard any updates of whether they're still doing it. I think they are still kind of maintaining this cable measurement. Now, the profiler version is all that I'm going to be talking about from here on. I'm not going to talk about the depth average velocity measurement of the EM technique, but the profilers, starting from Tom's devices in the 80s, did form a critical piece of the Garrett-Monk spectrum. And then some collaborative work between Mike Gregg and Tom Sanford at APL resulted in an instrument called the multi-scale profiler, which had both microstructure shear and EM shear, and also microstructure temperature measurements and low frequency and kind of like standard CTD temperature measurements. And so that was able to kind of come up with some ideas of what the combined full spectrum of both temperature gradient and shear look like in the ocean, and that actually kind of got a lot of the internal wave. I mean, so this is the lower resolution, the lower wave number part of this spectrum is basically what became the Girton-Munck spectrum, because it did seem to be mostly the internal waves, and then the higher wave number part. So the lower wave number part is sort of hundreds of meters down to 10 meters, and then the high wave number part is sort of 1 meter between 10 meters and like a centimeter in wavelength. And in both in temperature and shear, you have kind of a turbulent part of that spectrum and an internal wave part of that spectrum, but they're not quite the same, and the separation is different. There's also sort of a saturation range in between, which is not entirely understood. But but our modern measurements of turbulent microstructure rely on the variable level of this turbulent part of the spectrum to give us the turbulent dissipation. And I'll talk a little bit about temperature gradient dissipation measurements, but turbulent shear measurements are also used to get kinetic energy dissipation. And then at the same time, observations showed there was kind of a variable level in this internal wave part of the spectrum in both temperature or really it's strain when you're looking at it as density, which is the primary interpretation of this, is that it's vertical displacements of isotherms by internal waves that's driving this. And there's a variable level in the internal wave part of the spectrum, both for strain and for shear, that actually correlates with the turbulence level. And so that was the basis of these fine structure parameterizations, and kind of one of the final versions of this was the Greg Sanford-Winkle paper 2003, which and there was also theoretical work by Frank Hennier, and also Kurt Polzin contributed to this with some of his work, and Eric Kunze as well. But the scaling of the internal wave part of the spectrum, basically the squared spectrum, so it's like the shear to the fourth. Sorry, this would be this one. Shear to the fourth seems to correlate with the turbulent dissipation level, and there's also a function of latitude that seems to work as well. This is showing the function of latitude. It's also a function of stratification. Anyway, so we have seen a lot of the. I mean, there are also groups later that have explored the limitations and potential modifications of these fine structure parameterizations, but there's for the most part, you get a pretty good view of the mixing and the diffusivity in the ocean from measuring the internal wave spectrum.
So when you look at these measurements, do you see a transition from internal wave spectrum to stratified turbulence? There's a lot of people looking at stratified turbulence, right? So is that signature clear in measurements?
I mean, it's not clear how to tell where the transition is between those, but it is in there somewhere, and exactly whether you're looking at stratified turbulence or internal waves is not always known. But I think generally the internal wave parameterizations use 10-meter shear, sort of 10-meter and longer scales, and then the microstructure measurements use like 1 meter and shorter scales, and in between there's some range of overlap. Probably this, exactly what's happening in the range in between. It could be stratified turbulence. It could be that it could be a sort of a saturation range of internal waves. There's been something like that found in the atmosphere as well. But that's definitely an area that could use some more clarification, and it's probably not uniform. It's probably not the same everywhere. So it does seem like, I mean, even these parameterizations, they seem to work well in kind of low mixing interior thermocline regimes, but near boundaries, near the mixed layer, in all sorts of other special cases, they probably don't quite work either. So I think all of these they're the point where we're at now, and we still need more work to answer that. But yeah, so there is stratified turbulence in there, but exactly what to do with it is still to be determined. I'll just talk a little bit more about some measurements of the variable internal wave shear level and relationship between that and mixing. In the DIMES experiment, well, at least just mainly to kind of show what we can do with the tools that we're using in this new experiment. So this is the EM apex float, the profiling float with the shear measurement on it. We were able to get shear spectra in different time averages, which actually agreed fairly well with kind of differences in forcing over at different times. And it does seem like essentially, well, essentially you do see variable levels, and this is a Southern Ocean experiment where there was variable wind forcing, and in general this shear level seems to vary approximately with wind forcing. And in this particular experiment there was a tracer release, and we have some verification that the sort of the background level and the slightly elevated background level that we saw in this experiment matched with the tracer's vertical diffusivity. Let's see, and yeah, so that's this view here. So this is also the EM apex floats in Drake Passage and the Scotia Sea and the Southeast Pacific. So really the blue is sort of the quiet. So the Dimes tracer release was west of Drake Passage. There was some tracer injected at about 1,500 meters depth, and then it was followed for 2-3 years after that point. And there was a series of campaigns to go and make measurements, and including EM apex floats on there. And essentially, I'm just showing this to show that we can make these shear measurements with the floats, and this is actually an interesting result, that the shear is elevated in Drake Passage and downstream, and fairly low in the kind of open Pacific upstream of Drake Passage. And the tracer measurement is the white star, and it matches with this fine structure shear mixing level pretty well. There's also one of the things with the EM apex is that we can look at the rotary structure of the shear, and with near inertial waves, at least, they are rotating clockwise in time, actually counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. And so if they're rotating counterclockwise with depth, then that means their energy is propagating downwards, and we can tell that from the polarization relations of the near inertial waves. So this is a decomposition between the solid and the dashed line. Is the solid line is the clockwise. Let's see. No, dash is counterclockwise. That's the downward propagating waves. So that's actually decreasing energy away from the surface, and then the clockwise is increasing toward the bottom of these measurements. This is not the bottom of the ocean. It's about halfway to the bottom of the ocean, but there is a hint that there's maybe some upward propagating energy that decreases as you go upward. And the clockwise energy is downwards. And then in Drake Passage and downstream, there's bigger levels, and there's also some other work suggested there was lee waves. I won't go into that at all, but the profiling float measurements are actually a pretty good way to get kind of along stream changes of water masses along with the modification properties that they're experiencing. And here's a little bit more about the specifics of the internal waves in this Dimes data set in the Southern Ocean. Two things sort of about the capability. So if you make two velocity profiles half an inertial period apart, they tend to have a lot of mirror imaging in the profile, and you can take the difference between those to get the amplitude of the near inertial component. And so the differences are shown in this right-hand panel, and we do see downward propagating energy over time from this float that was cycling continuously up and down and making half inertial measurements. Sometimes we've had floats drift for a while and make two profiles half an inertial period apart. I'll talk about another potential option for trying to get both inertial and tidal information from a handful of profiles. But that's yeah. So at least we're starting to get an idea of how to identify where these waves are, and they do tend to have particular vertical wavelengths. It's not always clear why they have a particular vertical wavelength, but this is a vertical wave number spectrum where the energy in these downward propagating near inertial waves is kind of focused around 200 to 300 meter wavelength in this particular region. Sometimes it's less than that. Often it's more like 100 meters. It probably has something to do with the depth of the mixed layer, but it's not quite a straightforward connection. Okay, now I'll step to another internal wave topic, which is, so I mentioned how you can get near inertial energy from two profiles with a velocity profiler. I'm now going to talk about how you can get internal tide energy from a few profiles with velocity profilers. This was done starting with Eric Kunze in Monterey Canyon. He had an experiment where he used expendable current profilers. That's sort of a precursor to the EM-Apex that we're using now. Expendable current profilers only can be used once, and you can drive around with a ship and you can do a rapid survey, which is very handy for something like this. And he made a survey with roughly 4 profiles in each location, and these red arrows show energy flux in the internal tide, semidiurnal internal tide propagating up Monterey Canyon. And the dynamics of internal waves do tend to focus them into canyons, and that's kind of an interesting finding. And then subsequently, Steve Jashek and Oliver Fringer ran a model to see where this energy might be coming from, and it suggested it was coming from a ridge to the south. And so there was a later observational experiment to go out and look for whether that energy was really there. And we did this again and found fluxes that matched pretty well with what the model did, but a little bit of variation. So, and so it does look like the internal waves. You can measure energy fluxes in internal tides, and I mentioned you can see them from satellite, and they're simulated by models pretty well. But they also produce interference patterns, and when you measure at one point the energy flux, you actually can get places where there's 2 waves that will kind of destructively interfere, and then you'll have an interference pattern where the energy flux changes rapidly, and it's not telling you that the waves are actually changing. It's just where you are in the interference pattern, and so that's something we have to watch out for. And as when people started going out and looking for these in kind of the early 2000s, they kind of realized that putting a mooring in one place to get energy flux sometimes is problematic because there's often an interference pattern and you need to kind of spatially average in order to get what the waves are. But in any case, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of exactly how you take these profiles and get an energy flux out of them. So this is maybe a little too much detail, but I'll try to go through it pretty quickly. And so in fact, what Eric Kunze and then later Jonathan Nash realized was that you only needed about 4 or 5 profiles to be able to get the energy flux of the internal tide. Now that seems difficult. You can do, but essentially you just take 4 points and you fit a semidiurnal harmonic to it, and as long as you're kind of evenly spaced in phase, then you can get a reasonable value. Now it only works if that's a fairly, I mean, there's definitely a signal to noise problem. So it depends on how much other frequency contribution there is. But if the internal tide is a major contributor, then it does work fairly well. And you can actually do the same thing with near inertial waves if they're the major contributor. And essentially, there's a couple of things that do help out. So, but this is just to show you what these profiles look like, just so you can see. Here's some velocity profiles. Here's some density profiles. These are all perturbations from the mean of a cluster of profiles. So I think there's 5 in this particular cluster. They look pretty noisy, and you integrate the density anomaly to get the pressure, and that looks smoother. And then you also have to remove the mean to make it baroclinic. And then one way to do this is just to take the velocity anomaly and the integrated pressure anomaly, and then integrate those 2 together to get a U prime P prime and a V prime P prime, and that can give you an energy flux. And that's not, you can do it without fitting a harmonic, and then you can also do it with fitting a harmonic, and that's actually, in this case, the black and the magenta curves are for those. So that is telling us that most of the energy here is in the M2 harmonic, and we actually do see an energy flux in this particular region that was kind of made sense in terms of the model and what we thought the generation looked like. But in any case, the harmonic fits also look pretty noisy. Here's the amplitude in UV and P pressure, the phase in UV and pressure, and then the residual, which means that's kind of, this is how much is left after you do that harmonic. And the one thing that kind of saves you for doing a low mode energy flux estimate is that pressure is an integration of this density anomaly, and if the low mode internal tide is dominant, then you get a fairly kind of smooth signal for that, and that is able to to kind of filter out. That's kind of an automatic filter on the velocities as well. But there are definitely other signals in the velocity profiles whenever we make these measurements. And but I think this kind of minimalistic approach for getting internal tides and other narrowband near inertial internal waves does seem to work in a lot of locations. So what we're going to do now is, well, here's some more examples of where it's been tried with profiling floats, EM-apex floats for internal tides on the left near Taiwan, and for near inertial waves in an eddy near the Kuroshio. So it's been done a few different places, not just on coastal internal tides. And in both of these cases, it seems like they make some sense, although exactly why the internal tide switches direction between these two different scenarios is not entirely clear. But they were at different times, different current directions, and things like that. Here, there's near inertial wave flux going into an anticyclonic eddy, which is encouraging. Okay, and then one last detailed slide is how you get turbulence and dissipation or diffusivity from fast response thermistors. I mentioned there's a turbulence part of the temperature gradient spectrum, and from on the EM-apex now we're putting CHI sensors, temperature microstructure sensors, on those floats as well. And Renshei wrote a paper based on the LATMIX experiment, the first one to do this with the EM-apex floats, and this describes the method. Briefly, there's some spectral corrections that are up here. There's fitting to a theoretical turbulence spectrum, the Batchelor spectrum, and there's in the measurements there's definitely a high frequency noise, a low frequency other stuff happening, and then there's a particular region where we see turbulence in these fast response thermistors. That's the FP07 thermistor. And that works very well with a slowly moving profiling float. For the people who have been doing microstructure in the past realize that for shear microstructure, it's better to move fast because they like to use these airfoil probes where the signal goes up as you're moving faster. But the response of the temperature sensor is a problem if you're going too fast. And so if you're moving slowly, then you can easily account for the it's fast, but not quite fast enough if you're falling too quickly. In any case, this is some high-end diffusivity profiles made from LATMIX, which did actually compare with the tracer diffusivity estimate made during that experiment. And essentially, you can get diffusivity from CHI. CHI is from the basically from the gradients. You're assuming isotropy, so it's really just using the vertical gradient in temperature to get this dissipation of the temperature variance. And you can also get kinetic energy dissipation if you assume a mixing efficiency, which is the gamma here. So if you don't think that you can believe what the mixing efficiency is, often people just use a nominal value of 0.2, which has been shown to be a good average for the whole ocean. But in certain situations where you have turbulence, different stages of turbulence, it probably is much higher than 0.2 or lower than 0.2. But in any case, if you do have both shear and temperature microstructure, you can estimate that. Okay, now we'll talk about SQUID and when am I supposed to be done? We have okay. So, but I shouldn't take too much longer on the. Okay, so here I'll describe this new experiment, and also I'll show you how you can be involved if you want to. We actually are making the data available from the project so far, but essentially we decided in order to both sort of build up our knowledge of the internal wave field, that's including internal tides, near inertial waves, and the general background spectrum of internal waves, and the fine structure that's causing mixing. We figured that a distributed program is needed, but we're not going to be able to cover the globe. Even Argo doesn't really cover the globe that well, but we're not going to be able to do anything close to that without 4,000 floats. So we figured that instead we'll try to aim for spanning a range of tidal forcing, a range of wind forcing, a range of mesoscale conditions, and around a range of kind of nearness or proximity to boundaries and boundary currents. And maybe we can do this with something like 50 floats kind of sprinkled around the world. So this is what we're trying to do, and the NOPP program agreed that we could do that. Now this is what we've got so far. We've got funded to deploy 50 floats, and we've got 22 in the water so far. There's a few in the North Atlantic, a few in the North Pacific, one near Hawaii. This is at a site from the Hawaii Ocean Mixing Experiment, so we can compare with the energy fluxes there. We've had several deployed on ghost ship cruises. This is a repeat hydrography program, which makes full water column measurements of several lines. Every year they do 3 or 4 hydrographic lines around the world. So we did one in the South Indian Ocean, we did one in the South Atlantic, and then we had a couple in the ACC. And we've got plans, yeah, so the map I showed before shows kind of the plan for the rest of the 50, including the ones that have been deployed already. But the ones that haven't been deployed are still uncertain, and we don't know exactly which of these cruises we'll participate on, but it may look like this at the end. Now, if I took the labels away, it doesn't look like it's covering much of the globe yet, but at least we do have floats in many different locations. And briefly, what we have found so far, here's one example of what each profile contains. There's temperature and salinity, there's density and velocity, and then this is the vertical velocity of flow. This is the temperature microstructure, which actually I think is kind of interesting to look at, because this is actually the spectrum that we're sending back in order to process these microstructure profiles. And so it is showing you this variable level of the temperature gradient spectrum and variable high frequency or high wave number cutoff. And so that's kind of what you would expect to see from turbulent variations in turbulence level. This is not directly chi. There's several steps to get to chi from this. What these floats are doing, the way we're sampling, mostly is to do bursts of profiles and then parking at 1,000 meters in between. So we're profiling at 2,000 meters, doing 5 or 6 profiles in a burst, and then parking in between. This is one component of velocity I'm showing here from 3 different floats. This is a float in the ACC. It had some strong velocities and also some variability in the bursts. Here's a float in the Indian Ocean that shows nice upward phase propagation and near inertial waves. That's downward energy propagation. Here's a float on the Madagascar Plateau, also in the Indian Ocean, which had a lot of variability near topography. This is running into the bottom here on top of the plateau, and then it kind of moved off over time. So there's really a lot going on in these. Here's a few more scatterings of different flavors of variability. We had one float on the Australian coast. Actually, I'll just show the labels. On the Australian shelf and slope was in a strong current, and then and there was one in another area where we've got kind of known internal tide generation that we can compare with. Now, I don't have the tide analysis to show yet, but that will be coming. The other thing I wanted to mention, though, is that in this same project, we're also compiling past data sets from the DIMES experiment, from some other Antarctic regional experiments, from a couple of North Pacific and North Atlantic experiments, and kind of trying to put that together into a format that we can get to a national data center that, and we're also trying to help the National Data Center at NCEI know what to do with velocity profiles, which normally they don't deal with velocity profiles, especially not from profiling floats. And we also have a cloud Explorer tool, which we've been playing around with developing, and you can actually look at that. Here's the website, and I'll show that on the next slide as well. But you can explore where the data sets are that we've gotten together, and see when and where the floats were deployed, and also get a little bit of a preview of the velocity and CTD data. Most of the previous data sets didn't have microstructure. They didn't have dissipation measurements in them. Let's see. I could do a little demo of that if anyone's interested, but for now, let's just summarize where the data are. So there is actually a link on my University of Washington homepage that actually has got even rapidly updating data files that if anybody is interested in looking at this, they can get data from. There's also the Data Explorer, and we're working on a pipeline to get the new float data to go directly into Argo, and we believe it's possible, but there's still a number of hurdles to get over to get it to happen. And then they will also be going to the NCI Global Ocean Currents database. We'll have some tools for searching this as well. Here's our contact information, but then finally, there's a QR code that has the link to my web page, and some summaries are mostly just about the fact that we've got this thing off the ground. We're discovering also ways to improve the reliability of the floats. They haven't all worked, but mostly they have working sensors. They have all working sensors, but then microstructure sensors tend to break. They're fragile, and this anyway, it's going. I would say it's an exciting thing to see, and I would love to have any questions about what I'm doing. I also had a couple of discussion questions if we want to move to other other topics. Thank you very much.
Yeah, do we have questions?
Not a very interesting question, maybe, but what about drift and the calibration of the microstructure probes and stuff? I mean, I was under the impression that that wasn't so great, right?
Yeah, so the FP07 thermistor is not a calibrated temperature measurement, but we do have the CTD temperature, which we're actually calibrating every bin really on the way up and down. So we really have the temperature gradient from the float CTD measurement, which has a much more stable measurement on it. So the Argo quality instrument, and then for the FP07 we just need the fluctuations, and so as long as we know, and they don't really drift. It's just that each sensor has a different calibration, and we have to do that with the comparison to the CTD. I don't think. We haven't really seen much hint of any drifts in the microstructure, but they do break, and so normally it's like they work up to a certain point and then you can't trust it anymore. There's occasionally cases where we have the noise level does increase over multiple profiles before it's fully dead, and then there are also cases where we think you run into a jellyfish or something and the level is weird for a while, and then sometimes it even washes off without breaking the probe, but. Yeah, with all of these, there's some data cleaning needed, and we're trying to. I mean, right now we kind of we have a lot of data that's not entirely cleaned up, but as we're making these things going into the archives, we're trying to remove as much of that we can find.
Yeah. Other questions?
Maybe I'll try one more. The near inertial profiles that you showed, right? That.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a number of, we haven't got the analysis from this data set yet, but from a number of other data sets, there often are sort of critical layers seen in at some depth, between 700 and 1,000 meters or something in an anticyclone, and it might depend on the vorticity, and maybe it's the place where the waves are not able to escape because the F effective of the eddy is it's the lower limit of the internal wave band is increasing as you go outside of the eddy, and then your wave can't exist anymore. So it's sort of a turning point or a critical layer. And so there have been a number of examples of seeing elevated near inertial wave energy at those depths. I think we do want to compare with altimetry. I think there is actually an altimetry database that that was trying to compile eddies and along with altimetry. And I think we might want to compare the float measurements to where the sort of eddy altimetry database shows them. But yeah, I think, so the products coming from this will include fine structure dissipation and microstructure dissipation, as well as the energy fluxes. Yes, question?
James, very nice talk, thank you. Could you tell us what the largest vertical velocities are at mid-depth in the ocean?
Well, so vertical velocities, there's a number of different things that you might be looking for when you want to know vertical velocity. So the largest vertical velocities are the internal wave vertical velocities. Like, so lee waves, when the flow goes over topography, can generate pretty large vertical velocities of several centimeters per second, even up to like 10 centimeters per second if it's a really big lee wave. Those are things we can actually observe from these floats as well. We can, so in one of these profiles that I showed, let's see. So this, the red plot is the vertical speed of the float, and it tends to jump because the float is changing its buoyancy in steps. That's what the green line is actually the buoyancy piston, and every time it changes, the vertical velocity of the float changes. So this is not the ocean signal, but sometimes there's signals in, so that here the float actually slowed down, and this is probably still mostly going through the stratification, but we can actually back out separate out the buoyancy piston, and we can probably estimate vertical velocities of the water to an accuracy of about a centimeter per second. Now, there are a lot of internal wave velocities that are that size, and those are interesting to see both in the mixed layer near the bottom and in the interior sometimes. But if you're talking about, like, say, the abyssal upwelling vertical velocity or the vertical velocity due to in a mesoscale eddy or something, those are usually orders of magnitude smaller, so we're probably never going to see those. But so like this abyssal upwelling vertical velocity that was estimated in the Kunze paper I mentioned at the beginning, those are, I don't remember what the numbers are, but it's probably like millimeters per day or millimeters, less than that, much less.
Maybe I'll ask a question. So you had that plot on diffusivity, we're showing diffusivity, tracer diffusivity. So are there observations that indicate that these tracer diffusivities are enhanced in the presence of high energy waves?
Well, actually, one of the, so in the DIMES experiment, so the problem with tracer releases is you can put the tracer in and you can measure how it evolves over time, but it's very hard to pin down, what process did the mixing. You could, and in the DIMES experiment, there was the tracer diffused very slowly over the first year as it moved towards Drake Passage. And then once it went through Drake Passage, where their flows are stronger and there's a lot of lee waves and there's a lot of eddy activity, the diffusivity increased dramatically. But which of those processes did it is a little bit hard to say. In fact, I think there was some indication that the tracer, there was an attempt to look at the edge of the tracer maybe was more in contact with the topography than the outer. So like the northern part of the tracer was more in contact with the topography than the southern part of the tracer. And I think there's some hint that the northern part actually had more mixing than more diffusivity than the southern part. But even that is kind of difficult to separate out. But and I think in the Latinx experiment there's maybe a little bit more evidence, but I think they did a handful of tracer releases. You remember anyone involved in Latinx?
Any other questions? Does that work?
Yeah, I see that you have velocity, temperature, and chi measurements. So you can, in principle, calculate the dissipation, and you can test your fine structure parameterization.
Yes.
Did you do this?
Well, that's coming. That is definitely one of the products we're working on for this.
There's no result yet.
No, I don't have that yet to talk about yet, but it will be part of this. Now, there's I think so. There's been a couple of different projects where the chi has been used, and yeah, I don't think we've really I don't think Renche or so there's a few of us have done it. I think we're trying to get to that point to give kind of more of a verification. We won't be able to. There has been some work which suggested that turbulent microstructure, like so mixing efficiencies might vary, and we won't be able to test that, but we will be able to at least just compare the chi, the temperature only diffusivity with the fine structure diffusivity. And then the other actually thing that's I think will be useful is the shear version of the fine structure diffusivity versus the strain version of the fine structure diffusivity. Because with the Argo float maps that have been fairly successful in looking at like global internal wave mixing, that's only the strain, and I think connecting the shear to that is one of the big goals of this project. Really. Sort of adding the shear fine structure to the strain.
Another question there.
You released the floats for the SQUID project in very specific locations that you chose, right? But how long are they going to stay in? I mean, what's the lifetime of these things?
Yeah, we're working. They don't live as long as we would like, but and you can make them last for a long time just by having the park phase be longer. But for one thing, I think the burst of 5 profiles is the minimum that I think is that's useful for the goals of this experiment. And so far they're maybe lasting. I might be able to last. Some of them are lasting up to 6 months or so, and so that's kind of the time frame that. But yeah, so we've had. There's several that are still going right now. Some of these ones launched in the South Atlantic, and most of those are still reporting. And this one was launched very recently. The others have all run their batteries out. We also have a potential to try to fit more batteries in for future deployments. But yeah, they do. We're getting yeah, sort of on. I think we're hoping for more than 150 profiles, but they haven't been lasting for longer than that so far. And I think it's partly the different systems. There's also a new microprocessor that the manufacturer put on, which I think is using more power, and so yeah. But it's roughly 6 months at this burst of 5 profiles every 10 days rate.
Yeah, Pascal.
Are there any other teams that are deploying instruments at the same time that could, for example, give you an overview of what the mesoscale eddy field looks like?
So we did launch 2 floats under this SWAT fast repeat phase crossover while SWAT was doing its 1-day repeat up here. And there was some mooring arrays there. We haven't done that comparison with those data yet, but that is something that we'll be working on. These 2 floats were launched under another crossover, and there was some measurements, not exactly where they were launched, but there was some pies in that region. But yeah, generally, and then there actually was a glider experiment where these 2 floats were launched in the ACC. So there was a mooring and a set of gliders from Caltech, as well as some drifters. With all of these things, it's hard to get a thorough description of the wave field, but there are a few things to compare with in there, and so that is also work in progress.
Could you also use the global drifter data set?
Yeah, and you mean for kind of like exactly contemporaneous comparisons, or kind of for regional? I mean, yeah. I think there's some hope of maybe comparing them in sort of a statistical way, but and I think there actually are, in a number of these Ghost ship launches, there was Argo floats launched in the same place. There probably were drifters in the same place in some of those, but I'm not exactly sure what the details of those were. Mostly, we're kind of these are sort of cruises of opportunity where because the actual ship time is not part of our project, so we're piggybacking on cruises whenever we can find them. Yeah, but I think the East Coast and West Coast are the best so far. Actually, there are a number. I'm going to launch 3 more floats on an upcoming cruise this summer, where there will be a bunch of other floats and some moorings in the area too. And those are kind of based around an acoustics experiment, but near the New England Seamount. But there should be some more comparison data there as well. But yes, there are lots of things to look for in these, and if there are students looking for projects, then that would be it's worth talking about what might make sense, and maybe in the context of a particular process going on in some of these locations.
I think there are no more questions. Let's, thanks a lot for the nice talk, James. Let's thank James one more time.